content you're about to hear may be graphic in nature. Listener discretion is advised.
Oh, how I wonder what it's like to relax. See the sky down under. Hope my plans collapse. Oh, how I'm under the surface of my tears, falling down asunder the meaning of my years.
This is True Crime XS.
In today's episode, we decided to bring on a guest who has done one of the deepest dives I've seen into a cold case. The deep dive is into the August 1992 murder of an 11-year-old girl named Holly Staker. She runs the podcast Someone Wicked This Way Comes. It's a podcast about the Holly Staker case and about all of the twists and turns that you might just get a little hint of in the media or the media is not telling you about at all. There's also an element of this case that is completely disregarded, and that element is that this case is unsolved, even though it's been adjudicated, which is sort of the opposite of what we usually talk about. There are several major twists in the case that very few people have been talking about, and it got on my radar, and I realized that this case has all the likelihood of breaking as any other cold case, if not more. One of the other pieces I want to talk to this creator about is like how much true crime content sort of comes along and is done by people who are really good at creating content, but really not great at knowing a case or doing the research related to a case. For the purpose of today's episode, we're going to call her Angie. Angie is the host of Someone Wicked This Way Comes. Thanks for joining us, Angie.
Hi, thanks, John. Thanks, Mike, for having me.
The simplest way to start this, because you're like us, you kind of keep low key in terms of like your biography and like your personal details. How would you like people to know that you became involved in researching this case? Do you want them to know like you lived close to there?
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. So I'm originally from Waukegan, Illinois, and the murder we're talking about and that I've done a deep dive in is that of Holly Staker. And Holly was a little bit younger than me, but I knew about her case because it was like local news, but it also was very local to me because it was in the neighborhood I grew up in. She went to my grade school and literally lived blocks from where I grew up. And so because she had been murdered when she was babysitting, that really stuck with me because I babysat a lot. That was something that I did to make like my money because my parents were old school, and if I wanted to have a season pass to Great America, which at the time was $50, which was like $1 million, right, to a kid, that I had to go out and make my own money to get that, season pass. So I babysat. And I even babysat for kids on Hickory Street. So when this happened, it was that horrific movie where, someone's in the basement and, they're calling you on the internal phone and you're the babysitter who's home alone. So it has always stuck with me. And that's why I have always wanted to know more myself personally. And then I realized that people in my neighborhood, people who had, been raised around there, were also still traumatized by this and had carried like this with them. They had always wondered like what exactly happened. And I thought, why not share my knowledge and the fact that I had access to information and I could look it up and kind of understand it maybe more than the average person so that I could help them also while I was helping myself possibly understand what happened to Holly Staker.
Would you say that this was the standout case for that area in your life?
I mean, I think for me, definitely, and for girls my age, definitely, because it got a lot of media attention. And now, years later, and understanding more wrongful convictions out of Waukegan, I realized there were other murders that were happening around that time that I have no memory of. But Holly's case stood out to me. So I think probably because of age, my age, and being close to her age and doing something that is a rite of passage to young girls, babysitting. So I think yes, it has stayed with a lot of us and of this age, of around the same age.
I was a little older than her, but Meg, I think you're her age, right? Holly's
I
age,
am.
rough.
Yes.
And when I came back around to this case last year before, I had always been under the impression it was solved. But I think the thing that grabbed a hold of me about the case is the fact that Holly was a twin. I'm
Yeah.
married to a twin. We have a lot of twins in our life. But it turns out it's not solved.
No,
And that's sort of where you pick up in all of this.
correct.
Was the exoneration, did that factor into you proceeding with the podcast? Were you under the impression that it was solved?
So I knew that Juan had been exonerated. And I can't tell you how I knew that, but I knew that. But
Like before he had been officially exonerated?
no, after he had been officially exonerated.
Okay.
I knew he was exonerated. You know why? Because Juan has used the money he got in his wrongful conviction settlement. He got $20 million, I believe. Obviously, he didn't get all of that because, there's attorney's fees and stuff. But he has used that money to do things like he opened a skating park or skateboarding park in Waukegan. And then he opened a barber shop on the north side of Chicago, which is specifically geared to young men who have come out of prison that are hoping to have a career, to go and do something. So I knew about him because of the things he was doing in the community, and I knew he had been exonerated. But I wasn't certain if they had, in fact, found Holly's killer. And the reason I started doing this deep dive is because one day my husband and I were talking about childhood bullies. And I mentioned my childhood bully. And I thought, I wonder where he is now. And I looked him up on the internet. And when I looked up Dion Marcadonis, all this information about Holly's case came up. And I was like, he was a suspect in Holly Staker's murder. So my childhood bully was a legitimate suspect in Holly Staker's murder. And that was truly what got my attention because I thought, oh my God, whoever has that much of a connection, right, to a murder that has stood out in their head. So that's
crazy. Yeah.
And that's really when I was like, okay, what's currently going on? That is when I went down the rabbit hole. And I have stayed down that rabbit hole ever since.
This is a little detail. I believe that Juan is factually, actually innocent.
Correct.
Not just he wasn't, his conviction wasn't overturned on a technicality or anything like that. He's actually factually innocent.
Correct. His DNA has not matched a single thing that was associated with Holly's murder. So that fact alone, even though he had a third trial because of the DNA not matching and he was found guilty again, because sadly of his coerced confession. And juries really have a hard time believing that someone's going to confess to something if they did not do it, especially if it's something that is so brutal, right? How could you ever say that you were involved in this? And, there's tons of evidence that, I think I mentioned on the podcast about the shoes that supposedly Juan owned and there was blood on it. They got it from a fellow prisoner who turned it over to the police. The police tested it. It was her DNA. Well, the defense team was able to prove those shoes weren't even sold in the United States when, when Holly was killed, that they were sold after Juan was in prison. Well, how did the DNA get on those shoes? How did Holly's DNA get on those shoes? How did Juan's? So there were a number of things that were very suspicious. The course confession was thrown out by the court, and the court was extremely critical about how that confession came about. And then again, the court, also talked about the DNA, how it didn't match because the crime scene was rich in DNA, and there was no DNA to match Juan's.
Yeah, that speaks volumes, and particularly for those of you who haven't caught up on the Holly Staker case. I encourage you to listen to Someone Wicked This Way Comes, and then come listen to what we're talking about here. Google it, dive into it. There's lots of court documents here. I think you did a great job pulling from those, but also pulling. I always end up sitting in court and thinking, what am I missing? Like, what is left out of this? And you found a lot of those elements.
I did. I worked hard.
Yes, you worked really hard on this. It's an amazing amount of research. In fact, most people that come on here, I ask them, do you have a case that's really close to your heart that you're going to be working on next with whatever they're doing with a book or a podcast? And I have to tell you, I feel like you have the one out the gate that was probably it's one of the most interesting cases I've ever read up on. But I feel like I can hear in your voice, see in the research how closely you ended up feeling to this particular victim. But I do want to veer away from it for a second and ask, how did the research make you feel about confessions and polygraphs?
Oh, I don't trust him at all. I mean, it's not just Juan's case. There are currently 6 wrongful convictions associated with murders out of Waukegan that anyone who listens to Someone Wicked This Way Comes will recognize, and that is Lou Tessman. He's a former officer of Waukegan and of the Lake County Major Crime Task Force. And he believes in the Reed technique, which is a form of interrogation that, was John Reed came up with it. He developed it. And Tessman has used it extensively, but Juan's case, he was interrogated over 3 or 4 days, and they would wake him up. They would, start to interrogate him again. So he was sleep deprived. He had a psychotic break during the interrogation, at which time, I can't remember if Tessman and his fellow officer hand wrote the alleged confession or typed it up. And then while Juan was essentially, in a fetal position, rocking back and forth, having ripped out portions of his hair that had the scalp attached to it, they handed him the piece of paper and told him to sign it. And then they took that piece of paper to Mike Waller, who was the state's attorney at the time, and Waller said, there's not enough information, you need to go back and get more. So there was a second alleged confession. And what's interesting is the jail nurse was the one who came forward to say, hey, this guy was having a psychotic break. There's clearly a problem with that. And it was completely disregarded. So how the state's attorney was able to get, that event from the jury's ears, because I think that's vitally important. You need to let the jury know that, yes, okay, there's this piece of paper this guy signed, but guess what was going on during that time? And not only that, Juan had what was considered a low IQ, so lower than the average person. And he had a history of depression and some mental issues. So he was ripe for coercing. I mean, he was the perfect victim.
Yeah, he was. And I don't know if you caught this while you were reading through things, but if you read the 2011 sort of the appellate summary, which is it's a pretty massive document. There's a total of 9 police officers coming in and having contact with Juan in these 4 days. So
that's a lot.
That all, it is a lot.
9 people coming at you?
Right. Like that feels a little bit like, a football game where you're the only guy on the other team.
Yes.
What's interesting about the Reid technique, so I'm trained in the Reid technique. It is definitely something that you can use in a number of ways. What's interesting about it is I work as an investigator for defense attorneys. So I'm on the other side of it all. And I sort of use it to my advantage at times to get information, but you can't get, in my opinion, you can't get confessions with the Reid technique in a way that you can trust them unless you have, it's interesting. It was designed to be used with evidence. So the idea originally was a good one. Unfortunately, even the person who developed it ended up abusing it along the way. But the idea was to weed out people. It's why we have holdback evidence. It was to weed out people who weren't really involved, but it ended up sort of being, I don't want to say hypnotic and make it sound magical, but it's almost like you're making a friend and the friend is wanting to please you. And it's particularly true with people whose IQs are a little lower or whose social IQs are a little lower. What's interesting about Reid is he was a Chicago police officer. So Illinois, for some reason, is still very, very high on John Reid, even though he developed this in the 50s and the 60s. He's from, Chicago.
Well, he has the Reid, their main office is here in Chicago, and that's where these individuals have been taken, Juan included, whenever they do the polygraphs.
Right. Yeah, so the technique was actually developed for a good reason, and the good reason was because it had been identified by the Wickersham Commission. I don't know if you're familiar with all of this, Meg or Angie, but I'll keep it simple. That the people in the United States federal courts had begun to recognize that maybe the most smart people in the country weren't police officers. And sometimes being a little less smart meant that you didn't necessarily feel like you had to follow the rules. So every time there was a drastic decline in unsolved crime statistics, they started to look at it and go, well, why is that happening? And what they found out was rather than actual crimes being solved, there was the development of what it would be known to in today it's sort of a joke, the third degree. So the third degree was the third stage of an investigation. So the first stage of an investigation is the investigation and the gathering of the facts and evidence and identifying suspects. The second stage is the interviews where you try and make people fit into places and times based on facts and evidence. The third degree is when you can't get them to do that. You can't make the puzzle work. You basically take out a hammer and you start hammering the pieces in place. Or if you have a suspect in front of you, you pull out a phone book. So the Reid technique was developed to stop violent interrogations.
Okay. Well, it makes sense that came out of Chicago, right? We have John Burge.
Right.
So they were trying to find some other way other than, brutally attacking alleged suspects.
Right. And the other thing that you do, I think you cover it in 2 episodes, but you kind of cover it a little bit in some of the other episodes, is you talk about the resources that were put into the investigation into Holly's murder. And you specifically talk about how many people they polygraphed.
Yep.
You talk about 10 of them in detail. Could you tell me a little bit about that without spoiling the episodes, of course? What did you think overall after you saw sort of the outlay of resources?
I was surprised that Waukegan polygraphed that many people. And I don't know why I was surprised by that, but I was taken aback by the number of people they polygraphed. But, for example, I mentioned Dion Marcadonis, who was considered, suspect high on the list. He wasn't part of that polygraph. Now, there may have been a later polygraph that I just never got my hands on, and maybe he was. Maybe there was, there were more people who were polygraphed. That said, I don't put a lot of, trust in polygraph exams, and I'll tell you why. I do work in the legal industry, not in criminal law. I work in civil law, and I worked with a young lady, an attorney. And while she was going to law school, there was a test that they wanted to do. Her professor said, I am going to pick one person out of this class, and I'm going to have them steal something from another student. And then we are going to polygraph everyone. I'm not going to tell you when it is, when it's going to happen, but you'll know when we start polygraphing people. And we're going to see if the person who stole, if their polygraph comes back as, indicating deception, or, if other people who had nothing to do with it, like how those come back. And what was interesting was this young lady said she passed the polygraph, yet there were other students in the class who didn't, who showed deception. So years ago, because of her story, I was like, yeah, I could see that. So and then after, reading these polygraphs and, saying like, oh, deception was indicated, or, there was something else indicated, I thought, again, we kind of go to how people come across. Like, if they're able to keep themselves calm, if they're, sociopathic, are they able to lie with a straight face and really believe their lies so nothing, comes up on the polygraph to indicate they were being deceptive? I do think those people exist. And then I think there are other people who are just nervous wrecks, and they're, may come across as being deceptive when in fact, no deception whatsoever. They're completely, truthful and honest. So I don't put a lot of stock, and I think that's why the courts don't put a lot of stock in it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I feel like there's so many variables involved, and if a law enforcement agency feels like they've got a viable tool because they've had success with it, that would be like maybe part of either ruling somebody out or not. But I wouldn't rely on it more than that. I feel like it has a lot to do with the administrator of the test.
Yes.
How they look at, the test as it's happening, and how they ask questions. I mean, I feel like there's just so many variables there that even if there was like a straight up way to perceive deception, I still feel like there's too many things that vary from the polygraph. What are they called? Polygraph administrator, I guess. Polygraphers, really?
Yeah.
There's so much that can vary from polygrapher to polygrapher that it's really just it's a subjective situation, I think.
Good job in using those two in tandem there, because that's a bit of a tongue twister. Polygrapher.
Yes.
So, hey, John, I wanted to actually say, so you were talking about the Reid technique. Well, what do you think about the fact that John Reid, who developed this, the first person he got a confession on, later it was considered a false confession?
Coming back to John Reid, he's also a polygrapher. Just throwing that out there. He was doing some interesting stuff that I don't think the Reid technique in the initial form ever worked the way John Reid thought it would. I think all of those, I think you're referencing Daryl Parker when you say that.
That's exactly what I'm referencing.
The case is a 1955 case, and I think it's Nebraska, maybe.
Yes, you're correct.
So this was how he sort of put boots on the ground. He had been working against a guy named Leonard Keeler, who had set up in Chicago and was also training police officers and prosecutors. They both had sort of competing polygraph training clinics in Chicago, which came out of this I don't remember exactly what it was, but I know it was called the Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory, or SCDL. I think it had been set up like during the Depression, and they were really just trying to combat thieves and the mob. They were specifically set up after the St. Valentine's Day massacre. So Reed had this like pressure on him that probably was akin to like the pressure of the late 60s in the space race. Like, I have to do this thing now, or I'm gonna I'm gonna kind of fade into obscurity, which for all intents and purposes he probably should have. He gets Daryl Parker to confess. Within 24 hours, Daryl Parker recants this confession, but it becomes evidence at the trial. He's convicted by a jury, sentenced to life in prison. But another man confesses later, and not only does he confess, but his confession is accurate to the facts of the matter, meaning he knew things that Reed had screwed up that like the jury had sort of been encouraged to overlook. And it's one of the early wrongful convictions. I think it's the first wrongful conviction based on false confession / bad polygraph work, bad Reed technique interview work. And he ends up getting like $500,000.
Yeah.
But that didn't stop John Reed. Don't you worry. He like went on to turn his experience into a book that he later would. I'm not kidding when I say it's a book. It like reads like fiction. It's called Reed's Manual, and I think it's got a longer title now, like Criminal Interrogation and Confessions. But the U.S. Supreme Court like pimp slapped it to the point that like they said it's so bad that we are going to rule in Miranda versus Arizona for Miranda, which created the modern day Miranda warnings because of John Reed's book.
His business and how he did it, he found the right state to continue to do work in, because Illinois is ranked number 1 in wrongful convictions in the entire United States.
Oh, I didn't know that. Ooh.
Yes. The Project Innocence ranked them, and Illinois is number 1. So at one point, Lake County was number 1 in the counties in Illinois in wrongful convictions, but recently Chicago took, the number 1 ranking again. So Lake County and Chicago constantly go back and forth in, rankings of wrongful convictions. And the thing is, Chicago, you would automatically expect, right? It's a larger city. But Waukegan, you sit there and you think, how is it possible that Waukegan, that, the population ranges between like 50 and 65,000 versus millions, Chicago, right? How is it possible that Waukegan can take the number 1 spot from Chicago? I mean, that alone should boggle people's minds.
I agree. Angie, that is baffling. But I was just going to say, I feel like I am not trained in the Reed technique, and I would be probably considered a critic of it. And I always felt like it took too much interpretation and evaluation that the officer or the investigator doing the interview, like, they have to be able to interpret things that I feel like most law enforcement investigators, or a lot of law enforcement investigators, would have a skewed view. And I think that is why the Reed method is responsible for a lot of false confessions, because they are not truly evaluating it. They're evaluating it according to what they think.
Yeah, it's a flawed criteria.
How they're responding, and they're like, they already have it in their mind. But I've always seen it, and it's funny that I'm saying this a second time because you mentioned your bully earlier. But essentially, a bully can get anyone to do anything. And that's pretty much what I have always seen the Reed technique as being, it's just a step-by-step process on how to bully somebody into
Interesting.
telling you what you want them to.
Well, I think it's interesting what, John, you said, that you feel that it's a good tool to a certain degree, but that there are other things that also need to be in play if you're going to use the Reed technique. And I think that's probably true with a lot of things, like at face value. Like, this is why you have these additional resources or tools that you would use to rely solely on the Reed technique, or even to rely on a confession. I think is problematic for the US, not just Illinois, not just Lake County, but the US, because I know there are other countries that don't go with confessions. There has to be something in addition to a confession that proves the person in fact did the crime, because the statistics on false confessions are pretty high. And you kind of, I get that, because you think about it, if you have been taught to believe that the police are in a position of authority and you have to listen to them and you have to believe them, you're now sleep deprived, you're not in your own environment, you're scared, your stress is, through the roof. And you have people who are in a position of authority who understand these certain techniques to then get into your personal space and say to you, you did this. I think about Jerry Hobbs. He was also a person, false confession. He confessed to killing his daughter and her best friend. And people just kept saying no one would ever confess to killing their daughter unless they really did it. Well, we know for a fact he didn't do it. George Torres, or Cruz, I think I'm getting the guy's last name wrong, but he had killed other people the DNA matched. So they knew it wasn't him. Jerry Hobbs, thankfully, was never found guilty because he was still awaiting trial at the time, but he supposedly falsely confessed because it was a coarse confession. And that's what worries me about confessions, is that I just think there has to be a lot more to it than just, hey, and in Juan's case, once the DNA came back as not his, the only thing they had was the false confession.
Well, so it's interesting that Juan comes up in the middle of all of what's going on with Holly Staker.
Yeah.
Because I distinctly remember reading the court documents, and I don't know if they're still out there because of the settlements, but it's been at least 10 years. It might be 12 years ago. Juan, you were talking about the settlement that Juan has. His settlement was with 8 organizations.
Mm-hmm.
The total amount that he got came from, and I say that because it's relevant to what we're talking about. It came from 8 organizations, and one of those organizations was John Reed and Associates.
Yes,
who
exactly.
John Reed had been dead for years, but it was still being run. Mm-hmm. And I remember reading the court documents from that, knowing very little about Holly's case at that moment, but looking at it from the perspective of, if they would have investigated at the time the degree of the other suspects, the way that Juan Rivera had to be investigated in order to prove his innocence, because they had the DNA from the SANE kit. I don't know what they're called in Illinois. They have a different word. But that's the physical evidence that's recovered from the crime, and specifically from the body. Here we have a sexual assault kit here. They call it a SANE kit, but I know Chicago has a different term for it. It's like a park kit or something like that. But they also looked at his the ankle monitor, which was monitoring him because he had been involved in a burglary.
Yeah, he was stealing car radios. That's how old his case is.
Yeah. People actually had car radios that you took the whole thing out, rather than now they're you'd have to take the whole dashboard. But that was I think that was a moment for me. I knew false confessions happened, but I think seeing it laid out, particularly, this sounds terrible, but the ankle monitor, knowing the DNA didn't match, you're okay, well, maybe he was a lookout or with another person, but the ankle monitor showed he couldn't have done it. So you have these false confessions. You have these essentially Reed technique interrogations, and then you have these polygraph examinations that are laid on this poor kid. I mean, I know he's not a kid by this point, but like, you look at that, and all I can think is, well, why didn't they do that trying to solve Holly's murder? Like, what had to be done by, like, essentially the defense team? I know they become the plaintiff when it's like a that type of lawsuit, but like they're essentially like for the defense. Like, that would have like solved so many issues related to Holly's case, but in the 90s, and they're clearly using information that was available in 1992, 93, and 94, even if they're doing it in 2014, 2015, to prove that Juan could not have had anything to do with Holly's murder.
And the other thing I want to say is there wasn't much time between Holly's murder and then Juan coming on the radar. It happened very quickly. Now, in the podcast, I said 10 months, but I've been corrected. I have someone who actually is fact-checking me now. And I'll bring this up. I'll clarify myself in another episode. But they pointed out that Juan actually was arrested and indicted 3 months after Holly's murder. 3 months, mind you. And I knew all of this was right before the November election, so the re-election of Mike Waller at that time. And there have been some to suggest that that's why, there was such a quick rush to judgment. But I just know in these other wrongful convictions that have come out of Waukegan, they have not been around election time. So I can't really say that in fact was the case. It probably, contributed to it. But 3 months. So to your point, John, like, why wasn't all this time and effort that was put into, going after Juan, not put into other truly viable suspects? Because there are a lot of suspects, and they were on the radar of the Waukegan police at that time. But those suspects were dropped once they had Juan in their sights and then indicted. So it was such a missed opportunity, because here we are back to where we started. Holly Staker's murder has gone unsolved. This is an unsolved crime. And that means that the false sense of security and safety that people of Waukegan had, thinking that Holly's murder had been caught, is not true. And, girls, including me, like, it's terrifying now to think that, okay, you think, oh, the police have done their job and the bad guy is now away and now I'm safe and I'm okay and I don't have to be so worried. I mean, you're still vigilant, but that it was a false sense of security. And there's, to me as a woman, and Meg, I don't know if you feel the same way, but I want to really believe that the bad guy has gone away so that I can maybe feel a little more safe in my community.
I agree 100%. And of course, now I feel like I've learned a lot, obviously, from all the investigative research that we've done over the years. And I realize that, I'm not waiting on anybody to come save me in the event that something's going on. But it would be a disappointment. Do you have any inclination? Do you feel like the investigators believed in what they were doing, or John and I talk about it a lot, and when we've talked about a lot of cases where the investigation's not up to par, and it's either being under it's ignorance or it's malfeasance, right? Either they don't know any better, or they do know better and they're deliberately derailing an investigation. In this particular case with Juan, once the investigators were doubling down after he was exonerated, it made me think that perhaps it was more of malfeasance to begin with, but I have no idea really.
So I think it's a combination of both. I do believe that Lou Tessman, and I've said this in the podcast, his nickname is Lying Lou, that officers knew this about him. I believe he knew what he was doing was coercive, and he created this, alleged confession. But I think other officers knew that? Maybe some who were close to Tesman knew that, but I do think probably other officers did believe that, the evidence was there and it, pointed to Juan, and they got their bad guy. My bigger question, though, is about the state's attorney's office. Now, the police, yes, I hold them to the same standard, but being in the legal industry, granted not criminal law, but being in the legal industry, like, I understand trials. I was a trial specialist for a while, so I was the person, who made sure the evidence was there. And if we projected something back in the old days, you had the boards that you had to put up, right? And then later, I used, electronics and the media and all this. So I understand evidence. I understand motions in limine, motions to bar, and all of that. I know it's different in criminal, but I get the general concept. My thing is, I just know in civil cases, when we have evidence and we look at it and it is suspect, it's our job then to really look into that to see, is this legitimate, challenge it however we challenge it, do depositions, do all the things we need to do to make sure that that evidence is accurate, especially if we're presenting it to the court. I have a hard time with the state's attorney's office for the second trial saying they were going to submit those shoes, and we're going back to the shoes again, to show that Juan was connected to Holly's murder. And then when the defense came in and said, we can prove these shoes were not even sold in the United States until Juan was actually in prison, so there's no way that it could be connected to Juan Rivera. How did Holly's blood get on there? How did Juan's DNA get on there? And
somebody put it on there, right?
Well, that's the only conclusion. Now, why wasn't, I don't know for a fact if that was fully investigated by, like, let's say the Illinois State's Attorney's Office to find out, was this planted evidence? We need a higher, power to look into this. All the state's attorneys did was say to the court, we're withdrawing that evidence.
Right. Oh, yeah, exactly. And
so they didn't use it in court, so they can say, well, we didn't use it in court, so you can't claim that we had false evidence, right? We didn't use it in court. No. That's not how that works. Just because you've pulled it and you're not using it now, something went horribly wrong here. And so I'm much more critical of the state's attorney's office and the fact that I do believe that someone in the state's attorney's office early on likely had serious questions about the evidence, about Juan's wrongful, or about Juan's confession, whether he was really the guy or not, and still just plowed ahead with it.
I've had so many issues with the state's attorneys up there. In fact, I've had issues with Lake County, but more so with Cook County on other cases that we've covered.
Jay Polhill?
Yep. Jay Polhill is one of those cases where like there was like a sort of a backroom deal made between two different state's attorneys that I have yet to get to the bottom of. But I want to make this clear for the audience in case they're not following what we're saying and they haven't yet listened to your full podcast. I just want to point out a couple of things because I have some questions for you and they relate back to this. Okay. So what we're talking about here is a pair of shoes that could not possibly have been on Juan Rivera's feet the night that Holly Staker was killed, having Holly's DNA on them. That's like a very deliberate act. Mm-hmm. So the police and the state's attorneys looked into other things related to Juan's story. Like there's this one thread that you mentioned, but like I read a long time ago and I've always wondered about because it's contradictory, but it's like understandable how we get there. This is like the state's attorney and the police doing a good job. One of the stories was that the way they get Juan is like they get a tip from another inmate, and he identifies this guy, Robert Hurley, as coming to a party, being sweaty and out of breath and having a scratch or a series of scratches on him. But according to an investigation that's directed by the state's attorney through the police, there's no party that night. Like, they have a name, they have a house, they have all these things. They like determine that like that's not possible. So one, I've always wondered what happened to Robert Hurley. Two, I've wondered, like, did that come out of like a misremembering of dates?
Yeah.
And three, how is it that they do good work and find that out, but then we've got these shoes with DNA on them that really the only way the DNA gets on them is if it's planted there, which up until a couple of years ago, I have now been disabused of this, but up until a couple of years ago, I thought cops would never do that. Particularly detectives who have been doing this a long time. And I've always thought that district attorneys and state's attorneys, which are sort of interchangeable terms in different jurisdictions, would never do that. Now, I know that's not the case anymore. And sometimes it's done to cut corners. Sometimes they really, really have a feeling that the guy did it, but they don't have the evidence.
Right.
Yeah.
But I don't think that there's I think that there's probably one person that did this. I don't think it's all of them.
I agree, Meg. I don't think it's some huge conspiracy, but I do think that one person, and I'm thinking it's more than one person. I think that like Lou Tessman is the main person, but I don't think that the state's attorney's office had a job in planting evidence, but the state's attorney's office does have a responsibility to look at that evidence with a critical eye and say, is this something that we can, in our role as an officer of the law and the oaths that we take, that we can say, yes, this should be presented to the jury and to the judge because this is true evidence. This is real evidence. And would the police, know that Tessman and I don't even know that it was Tessman who put the blood on there, but we'll say some other officer who put the blood on the shoe. No, but there were other things to me that were red flags that it appears that the state's attorneys constantly turned a blind eye to. And that is extremely problematic.
Do you think it could have been handled behind the scenes?
What do you mean?
Like, while we didn't hear about it, that the attorney went back and said, look, I just presented shoes that couldn't have possibly existed. There's something going on here. And some sort of something happening behind the scenes as far as, I feel like it would have come out if that was the case. Like, we found the person who did this.
Oh, who planted it?
Yeah.
I've never gotten a straight answer on that one. So some things
I can't even imagine not.
I agree with you. I agree with you. But why don't we know more? Like, why are you keeping it a secret? Again, this goes to the whole kind of, is it the code of silence? I don't like the code of silence because what you did does have an impact on the public at large. And if we talk about public safety and we talk about transparency and we talk about accountability, right? Now in 92, were they having those discussions? No. But I do know in 2008, we were having those discussions, and that's when Juan's third trial happened. Why doesn't the Waukegan public know more? And if there was an investigation into who planted those shoes, and it was likely someone who was, highly involved in the Holly Staker murder investigation, why were some of those highly involved people never let go? Most of those investigators, those police officers, went on to have, I'm putting it in air quotes, stellar careers with the Waukegan Police Department and the major Lake County Major Crimes Task Force.
Yeah.
Well, right. Seeking justice as opposed to furthering your career.
Yes.
I feel like in this particular case, especially, to have to say we were wrong, it doesn't really coincide with their prerogative, I don't think.
No, I agree with you.
But Do you think, and actually, John, you may know better, but could that, and I don't know exactly how what happened, except that they presented the shoes and then they said, hey, these couldn't have existed. But couldn't that have been grounds for a mistrial?
It was the timing of when it was done, I think, right?
Exactly.
I'll let you take this one, Angie.
Okay. No, because the thing is, they hadn't presented it. So prior to the criminal trial, prior to even civil trials, you have to say what evidence you're going to use, right? And so you present that to the court, and then the other side gets the opportunity to, contest it in some fashion. And so that was the stage this was at, that the state's attorney had said, we're going to present this. And then Juan's defense team was like, hey, no, he didn't have those shoes at that time. And that's where the debate came in. And the state's attorneys was like, yes, we know, like he traded these shoes, blah, blah, blah. There's Holly's DNA was, and thankfully, and I think this was just a fluke, I don't know, maybe Juan's mom is one of those people that keeps every receipt for everything she buys, but she had the receipt. She bought the shoes at Walmart. She knew she bought them while Juan was in prison and gave them to Juan while he was in prison. So then the investigator was also able to track down the manufacturer of the shoe to say, yeah, we manufactured those shoes at this time, and we only sold them in the U.S. at this time. So they were able to prove not just by the receipt, but also by the manufacturer of the shoe when, in fact, they were being sold in the U.S. So when they went back to the court, when there was an additional hearing about, the evidence, then that's whenever the state's attorney's office was like, okay, we're not going to use this evidence then in trial. So they never used it with so the jury never heard about it or saw it.
So once they rule all that out, and this happens much, much later, Meg, it shows up in the appellate documents. There's a federal judge during one of the habeas corpus hearings. He's like, you guys need to take a look at those shoes. So the shoes are examined. They discover that the blood does belong to Holly Staker, which was alleged before it was withdrawn back in the 90s. But they also discovered it had a second profile on it, which would have been the semen sample taken from the crime scene.
Mm-hmm. So somebody just pulled the evidence out and wiped it on there.
That's kind of what it feels like.
Which is disturbing. Like, who's taking a semen sample and pouring it on shoes? And why are you destroying evidence? Like the semen, we know at this point in 2025, I believe all the usable DNA from Holly Staker's murder has been used up.
But there's a profile, though.
There is a profile. It's unfortunately not a full DNA profile. But I had always hoped that if there was still usable, evidence, that they would be able to pull it, test it, and maybe get a full profile. But at this point, I have been told there's no use. They've just used it all up. There's nothing left.
So it's unlikely they'll be able to do genetic genealogy then. All they can do is eliminate or include a particular person in a comparison.
Correct. And that's why Delwyn's case is so important and intertwined. Because there is a connection. They do have DNA that they are constantly testing. So we're more likely to find the perpetrator of Holly's murder because of the crime scene evidence of Delwyn Foxworth's murder.
And it showed, and so that was connected on CODIS, right? Or was it the state comparison?
So and this is one of the areas that I am still unclear about. I know in 2014, the Chicago Tribune came out and said there is a DNA link. I've never found out how the Trib found out about that and exactly when the Waukegan Police Department knew about it. Because Delwyn was attacked in 2000. He died in 2002 due to his injuries. And then they pursued Marvin Williford. I think Marvin Williford, and my timing might be slightly off with Marvin. I believe he was found guilty in 2004. So when was the DNA link made? Now, Juan had to sue the FBI for the FBI to do a DNA search in their CODIS database.
Right.
And
Mm-hmm.
the FBI said, fine, we'll do a keyboard search, because Judge Pallmeyer, the federal judge, was like, just do a keyboard search, guys. Like, come on. So they did. But the FBI came back and said, our policy is not to store this because the lab who did this is not FBI certified. So we're not going to store the DNA in CODIS.
So it can't be searched against.
Yes. So I know Illinois was searching, and I know Illinois requested that Wisconsin search their databases. So those were routinely searched. But the FBI's CODIS database, now, that said, Delwyn's, the DNA from Delwyn's murder, I do believe, and I've not gotten 1,000% confirmation, but pretty much 70% confirmation that the DNA from Delwyn's case is stored in CODIS. So that probably means that then that DNA that's linked, right, between Delwyn and Holly's murder is in CODIS and it's being searched. But I've never been able to truly confirm that.
And hopefully there's a notation that it's linked.
Yes, I hope so. But you know what, at this point, Meg, this case has just been so insane. I don't know. I mean,
I completely understand that. And my thought is, as time passes, that there was some sort of match. And now you did have somebody tell you perhaps not to concentrate so much about the link.
Don't put too much stock in that. And I'll be honest, the person who mentioned that, I don't, I haven't interacted with them enough to say that I, put a lot of stock into what they say. So I still do think there's a link. I think that link exists because, Waukegan, the state's attorney, has been routinely testing that evidence, and it's under seal. And at this point, I just think, why would you be so secretive and have it under seal, but for the fact that there's more to this than just, hey, this is, we can prove, or actually in this case, Marvin's DNA is not connected to Delwyn's murder scene at all. But the DNA, there's something there that the police don't want us to know about. And it's not just the maybe possibly 2 other people or 3 people who were involved in Delwyn's murder. I honestly believe it's because of Holly's murder, which is far more high stakes for Waukegan than Delwyn's murder out of North Chicago. Almost no one knows about Delwyn's murder. When I went to Waukegan and put flyers around the neighborhood to say, hey, Holly's murder is going unsolved for 32 years here. If you have information, please share it with me. And, people, when I was talking to them going around to like Cribs, I went into Cribs because it still exists. That's where Holly went to get the pizza and the juice, right? And the clerk I was talking to was like, oh, yes, I know exactly. Oh, it was so terrifying. And I said, well, the guy who was originally arrested serving time was exonerated. And she said, yeah, I heard that. And I said, they've never found the killer. And there is a second murder that's linked through DNA. She did not know that. I would say 70-80% of the people I talked to in Waukegan did not know about the North Chicago murder where there is DNA linked to Holly's murder.
Yeah, I definitely, if not a higher percentage of people that would know about her case and not the other one, because you're right. There's, and it's not uncommon for children's cases to be, a big deal as far as remembering them.
Well, that was one of the ways that we sort of get involved here is you had shared some of the documents with us in a way that we were hoping we could use what was available of the DNA, but like what they're letting out is more sort of the binary part of it. And it's
do they have DNA? So do you have any idea if there were 3 profiles generated from that crime scene?
So in Holly's crime scene, there actually were two unknown male suspect DNAs that were pulled.
Okay.
But that doesn't necessarily mean, some people think maybe there were two, but the vast majority of people think there was one person who was involved in Holly's murder, and that one of those profiles, so I think they called it a secondary, was just, DNA from people who had lived in that apartment or had come and gone from that apartment, and not necessarily the killer. Now, from Delwyn's murder scene, they do have three profiles of unknown male suspects that were pulled from the 2x4 that was used to beat him, and the gas can that was left behind, and the gas can that was used to douse him with gasoline and set him on fire.
Well, I think that there's profiles, and one matched from Holly's case, right?
Correct. Yep.
And so I know that I believe the criteria that it has to meet to go into CODIS, I do think it can be used for genetic genealogy. So, I mean,
you mean the one from Delwyn's scene?
Yeah, because it's in CODIS.
Gotcha.
And so I believe, if I recall correctly, I think it's something like 18. There has to be, and they change it, so I'm not sure, but like 18 marker matches, and that's enough to start a genetic genealogical search for DNA, trying to identify someone. Like I call it kind of reverse searching, because you've got the profile, and you're going backwards. But if I recall correctly, that would mean, even though it's a partial profile for Holly's case, of course, I wonder how they matched it, though. That's interesting. I do think that it might be enough. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at it. I'd have to look at the characteristics of it more carefully. But, in theory, if any of those three profiles got a match, you'd be one step closer to solving it, because you could, ask them, especially if it helped them, in the situation. As far as, to me, it would be sort of worth it to solve both of those.
I think if they got someone, right, and they were truly connected to Delwyn,
they could just say, hey, we're willing to give you, a slightly better than, sentence. I mean, they still need to be punished for it, but I feel like whoever they identify could absolutely, if it's not the person that matches in Holly's case, they could give up their accomplice for, a little bit of a break.
Yeah. And
Go ahead.
And John,
I'm sorry.
What's the chuckle for?
Just the way that she phrased that, they should definitely give up the accomplice. They should. I mean, honestly, at this point, it's so old. So think about it this way: if they're 20, or just say 20 years old, because that's a nice even number, then they're now 53. So,
but that would have been at Holly's when Holly died, right?
Yeah. You're right. It's 8 years younger in terms of Delwyn's case, because it's in 2000 instead of 92. But I was just saying, whoever it is, give up someone in this mix, or eventually somebody from that 2000 case is going to get found, like those other profiles.
I believe that. I really do. And I feel like, with a little, I don't know how much, so I feel like in Holly's case, they're not going to pursue that because there's so much sort of, it's been adjudicated, overturned, and closed. Or, I mean, I know they say it's a cold case, but I don't feel like the work is being done, possibly. And so that would, you've got to put effort into the whole genetic genealogy thing.
And it costs money, right?
Right, exactly.
And when I talked to an officer, and I don't recall his name now, and he just kept saying, this is an open and ongoing investigation. And I asked, well, does Waukegan have a cold case unit, or, officers dedicated to cold cold cases? And he said no. And I said, okay, so, Holly's case is open and ongoing. How often, are officers working on it? And he was like, well, when they get time. Well, I'm from Waukegan. I like, that's my hometown. And of course, I love it and has a special place in my heart. But I also acknowledge the challenges that town faces. There's high unemployment, drugs, gangs, crime, and so like if you say we're working on this when we have time, that translates to you're never working on this, right?
Yeah.
Because you're going to
Exactly.
work on the case that is the most current, because that likely is the case you're going to be able to solve, versus the cold case that no one has solved that is going to take more resources and time. So
Right. And there was a guy that already had 3 trials.
yes.
I
And
feel like that weighs into it. I mean,
oh, I agree. I agree 100%. And I do believe there's still officers of the court and law that believe that Juan Rivera is still guilty. I honestly believe that. That is what Tessman still says to people. That's what Waller constantly said to the Staker family. We got the right guy. It was just the judges who let him go.
right. And that undermines any possibility of serious continued investigation, I think, unless something else changed. But to me, like when you rely on somebody that is skewed, their opinion is at least skewed. They're saying, well, it's terrible that, the killer got away, when instead of saying it's terrible that an innocent person was in jail for this. I mean,
Really good point, Meg. Really great point.
it's completely backwards. But
Yes.
when people hear them say that, they if they are either too traumatized by the event to actually like think about it, or if they lack critical thinking skills, they could actually just believe what they're told, right? That the
Well, I
killer
think,
got away.
yeah, your first point, I think, is spot on for like family or people who.
Of course, of course.
This, I mean, I know it haunts me and other, now adult women, but, women who were Holly's age or around Holly's age. But I can't, I know I cannot understand what her parents went through, what her twin sister went through, and what they continue to go through. Like, I know that. And me, I'm not going to try to minimize or pretend like I understand their pain. It just, and I have no doubt that they relive it on her birthday, on the date that it happened, like all of those things. And I just want them to get justice. And I, hope that people who are connected to this do understand that the podcast was not a goal to open, a wound that had started to heal, but it really was to find justice for Holly, because she was portrayed in a way in newspapers that was disgusting. I mean, they asked her sister about if the girls had sex, if they were already sexually active. She was 11 years old. What did that have to do with anything?
They
Right?
they should be ashamed of themselves,
Yeah.
honestly.
And you could say, okay, in 1992, maybe we didn't know. But no, I'm talking about the third trial that happened in 2009. We knew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This, you do not victimize the victim. And even if, say, for argument's sake, she was 11 and she was inquisitive with kids her own age, that's, her choice, and kids can be that way. But you don't suggest to the jury that the reason Juan's DNA doesn't match, the DNA that was retrieved from, her private parts they didn't match because she was a sexually active 11-year-old.
Right. And it's, and obviously logically it doesn't make sense that there was no question that she was sexually assaulted
Yes.
before she was murdered.
Yes.
And the DNA of, the murderer is what you would find.
Yes.
If nothing else, in addition, right?
Yeah.
So if she somehow had consensual sex with somebody, well, the DNA would be there, but so would the killers. I mean, and it was an inappropriate stance to take.
Even the court, like the appellate judges, John, and you probably read that. Like they were highly critical of that.
Well, it was the wrong position.
Well, and there was an expert that they took the time to explain why that scenario was irrelevant to the rape and murder of an 11-year-old child. It was done very carefully. They explained how the DNA was mixed and how it would not have been the same type of DNA from someone that she had a consensual encounter with. I think they said even like an hour earlier, but it could have been that they were talking about in the previous days. And they explained activity of like 11-year-olds who are babysitting that are walking back and forth between houses and how it would change where DNA could be found in the body and on the clothing and in the underwear. They went through great detail to point out that like the things that were being posited as potential theories were not potential theories that made sense in this case.
And
I did want to ask. I'm sorry. Go ahead. No, I cut you off.
I just wanted to say something that they made Heather, the twin, testify to things that to me really also victimized Heather, the twin.
100%.
And I felt like that also was a travesty. And that's something that I don't think that is addressed enough, is that here you have a twin who has lost her twin in a brutal way. And now you're forcing her to talk about things that really have no relevance to this case whatsoever, but to prove your wild theory, and to distract the jury from the fact that the DNA did not match, we're going to take this twin who is living a nightmare and have her sit here and talk to strangers about like if they were ever, and we would call it now sexually abused, or taken advantage of by, say, family members or by, neighborhood people or whatever, to talk about these type of things when that had nothing to do with this case.
Right, and they lost sight of the horizon there, and I feel like somebody should have reined it in.
I agree. The judge.
I don't know who that could have been.
I felt like again, we're talking about the appellate decision that exonerated Juan. In that appellate order, it was really interesting because the court also pointed out that it was the defense who, in their appeal, said that essentially the state's attorney violated the rape. I'm trying to think of the law, where essentially you cannot kind of abuse the rape victim, right? You cannot use their background. You cannot use certain things to essentially tear down the rape victim.
And that's exactly what they were doing.
Yes. And the defense was the one who said this. And the court said the fact that the defense had to say this to essentially protect the person that their own client is being accused of raping and killing, really showed just how messed up this whole thing was.
I mean, that's really bad because typically they use it. The reason that come up to begin with is so men charged with rape couldn't belittle their victim.
Yep.
Yeah, that's the whole reason for the rape shield laws. It's the whole reason for victims' rights. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so you're just in in bizarro world, right? Because everything is backwards.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got a lot of inside baseball in this case. Do you think we'll see something in the next year or two where Holly's case may actually have a chance at some justice?
Well, John and Meg, I hope that the podcast and our conversation here and my constant needling and everything else will bring true justice, and they will find the person who killed Holly and possibly, Delwyn. I wonder if this person is connected to other crimes in Lake County, Waukegan. I suspect they are. So I hope. Do I have absolute faith it's going to happen in my lifetime? I hate to say no, I don't. But that's why this podcast exists, and that's why I'm continuing to do this. I have a full-time job, so I don't need this. I don't need to, take time away from my family and other things I could be doing, but I'm doing it because I really am bothered by the injustice of it, and I really want to see justice for not just Holly, but also for her sister Heather, and for the young girls of Waukegan who are now adult women, many of which still live in Waukegan and around that neighborhood. So I'm going to work my darndest to make it happen.
And I think it's commendable that you're doing that. I think people miss that part of things because we're so saturated with content that is pretty much there for the spectacle. A lot of people focus on different trials and different cases that, to be quite honest, content creators just cover the same thing over and over again. So what you've done is really special. It's really unique. Your hard work is to be commended, and I hope it does lead to justice for Holly Staker.
Thank you. I hope so too.
Meg, I'm going to move to off-topic stuff for a second. Is that all right? Okay. Actually, I do have two more questions about this case, and then I'll do that. I just have a list of questions I want to get through because I like to have the material.
Okay.
What was the single hardest thing about telling the story in podcast form?
Probably because I would like to tie evidence to what I'm saying, or tangible things to what I'm saying. And that's why I created the Facebook page, so that I could upload certain things. Because if people are like me, I don't just go off of what someone says. I want to see it. I want to read it. I want to see a picture of it. I want to do something. So that's hard because of a podcast, right? And I'm not on YouTube. And part of the reason I'm not on YouTube is, one, I don't want to go on camera. And I think just listening to something on YouTube is, for me, less enjoyable than listening to it in a true podcast form. So I think that's the hardest part is not being able to say, okay, here is the document. I'm holding up the document I want to show you that I'm currently talking about. So I think that's a challenge.
I know it's hard telling a story about this next question, but did you have a favorite part about or a part that was really endearing that you found as you were doing the research on the case, and then after you had done all the research and you started putting the puzzle together, telling the story? Is there a favorite part for you in all of this?
So, yeah, I get what you mean by, how do you say a favorite part when you're talking about a brutal murder of an 11-year-old?
Exactly.
But,
yeah.
Yes, I will tell you, I knew that Ray Bradbury was from Waukegan, and I like sci-fi, and I wanted to somehow connect the, Waukegan part and Ray Bradbury part. So that's where the name comes from. Something Wicked This Way Comes is a book by Ray Bradbury, and Greentown is actually Waukegan, and he uses Greentown as the setting of a number of his books. So that's why I changed the name to Someone Wicked This Way Comes. And as part of my research, I found out much more about Ray Bradbury and his family and, all of that. So that was enjoyable to me. I liked that.
That's cool.
I think that's an awesome way to have done this too, by the way. I love that story, and I love the movie. Not everyone loves the movie, but I love it.
I think if you like the book, I think the movie is hard to enjoy. But I think that's very common, that you either like the book or the movie, not both.
Yeah, it just happened that it had Jason Robards, and it was from that time in the 80s where I thought those types of sci-fi and fantasy movies were magical. And I love that part of it. They're definitely different creations. So aside from this, are you really into true crime? Are there things that you listen to and things that you like to do in terms of types of cases and genres of cases?
Yes. So I listen to you all, True Crime XS, obviously. And I do, for true crime, I like when they go into the legal aspects of it. So that's why I really like True Crime XS, because you talk about the law, you talk about other things that, kind of go into Not just this person was killed and, this person was accused, or you have talked about wrongful convictions. You've talked about, serial killers. Like, I was really fascinated by your Jay Pohill case because, again, being from Illinois and then being familiar with Chicago and the fact that he was a student and the things that happened, I was familiar with, the place ultimately, I believe, where they found his body, things like that. So I like factual true crime as opposed to true crime that doesn't have a lot of evidence, but is more salacious, right? It's more kind of gotcha, and that was the thing too, to tie it again back to Holly Staker's case. I believe I've listened to everything out there, podcast wise, about Holly Staker's murder. And there were a couple that just annoyed me to death because I was like, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. And like when I find out that I have said something incorrectly in a prior episode, I make a note of it and I correct myself at some point because this is not about being salacious. This is about, you need to know the facts, and here are the facts. So if I got the facts wrong, I need to correct myself. And that's what bothers me about kind of these shorter form true crime, that they don't have enough time. They don't research it enough, kind of like what you've said, and it's not accurate. And I don't want to be lied to, even if it's unintentional. I want to know the truth.
Yeah, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate it. I never know what to say. We have our rule here is like if we have a question about something, or like if something pulls us in for more than a couple of hours, like we talk about it or text about it. That's our most frequent thing, is we'll start texting about a thing and it'll grow into like, oh yeah, we're covering that because we have opinions. And like I used to spend a lot of time on Wikipedia, like editing things and like inciting sources. I had to stop doing that. It's one of those things where, like today, I get sucked into TikTok a little bit.
I don't do TikTok.
Oh, okay. I don't like really do it. I've done a couple of things on there, kind of in the fiction realm, to see what would happen. But I get sucked in more and more because more and more cases that I'm involved in professionally have TikTok and Snapchat elements. So I have to learn about that stuff. And once I learn, I like go on there and like I'm always like fascinated by the glut of people telling 3-minute true crime stories. I'm like, I don't even know what's happening.
Yes. Yeah. No, I don't get that. So
what do you think of like the 24-hour news cycle? I know you mentioned Facebook, which I would like to have the link to the Facebook group if you want to share it.
Yeah,
I'll put that in the show notes. But what do you think about like, there's kind of always an audience, like you can log on any time of day and somebody is talking about true crime cases.
So I don't know if you've ever seen the meme where it is like someone says like, my husband asked me like, how did you get so interested in true crime? And I say to him, I don't know. And then below you see a picture of the Nancy Drew book, and it says the books I read as a child. And that's me. Like I don't know why, but my mom got us like Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, and I had Encyclopedia Brown. And so those were the things that I read on a constant basis. So the true crime, like 24-hour news cycle doesn't bother me, with the exception of it's the same stories over and over and over again. Like currently, what's her name? Reed. I can't think of her first name.
Karen Reed.
Karen. Well, you would think I would know Karen. Karen Reed. Like that's covered to nausea levels for me. And I'm like, okay, I get it. She's attractive. She's got like a group of people who don't understand what's going on or the facts of the case, but instead, are following this talking head that's convinced that she's innocent and being railroaded, right? But it's like, okay, like, can we move on to something else? I'm certain there's more out there that we could talk about or cover that is not being covered. And I'm going to again go back to Holly's case. Like that, Holly's case is more of a high profile case in Waukegan, and I think other people do know about it because she was a young girl. But I'm sad for Delwyn Foxworth. I'm sad for this black man out of North Chicago who was killed, who ultimately died a horrible death because he had, third degree burns over 80% of his body and lived in and out of, rehab facilities because of the injuries he sustained, but no one knows about his case. Why? That's really sad.
Right. That's exactly how we pick things too. I mean, we try to cover things that don't get the limelight, but they should.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm sitting through a murder case it's not exactly similar to Delwyn's case, but it is. Like, it's one of those cases where there's a tangential link between the victim, who is obviously a victim, and then the person charged with first-degree murder. They have this meeting, or whatever you want to call it. I'll call it a collision, but it's like, two people physically meeting in a store, and now the victim in that case was okay from what happened, and then they suddenly weren't from one of the procedures like related to what had happened, and like much later they passed away, and there's questions about like, is it because of right, like which thing here are we going with? And I personally don't think it's first degree murder, but I do think it's like a crime worthy of like a charge and a conviction.
Like involuntary manslaughter?
I think it's a voluntary manslaughter, not involuntary. I think it's voluntary. I think the guy deserves to do like the presumptive range for voluntary manslaughter. And that's just my opinion. As like, I try to come at everything from like a level-headed perspective, and like I get a lot of eye rolling. Oh, that's just from the defense perspective, but the truth is, it's because like, I've seen what first degree murder looks like, and that ain't it. But there's problems with the case that kind of like make me go, why is this on trial? And like, we're not pleading this out to like a voluntary manslaughter in the presumptive range and like everybody go home. Because I think that the problem with some people is he's been sitting so long. This happened so long ago because it was during the pandemic, that like basically if he were to get voluntary manslaughter as a plea right now, he would walk out because of the way that time is audited. So there's that. I don't know. Meg and I, we talk about these cases. We do. We have these weird collisions with real life. For instance, in Holly Staker's case, I was given the opportunity to go do some different types of continuing legal education around the country. And one of the things that I do or need more work with is death investigations. And I was suggested a homicide boot camp. And it turned out that Lou Tessman was one of the people presenting. So I was like, no, I'm not going to that. And then I thought about it. I was like, maybe I should. Maybe I should go sit in on it, because then I would understand better what's happening. So there's that. Like, that's where like our real world and the podcast collide. Yeah.
But in speaking about that, he is a trainer. He goes around and the state pays him, and I think some private organizations also pay him, to train in the Rhee technique. And I just find that mind-boggling when you have a man who is now linked to 6 wrongful convictions. And more, I'm just talking with the wrongful convictions that I say, the 6 are murder-related ones. He's connected to other like wrongful convictions that were related to rape, but I'm focusing on the murder part of it. So 6 out of Lake County. Those statistics.
Well, I had picked those when I heard you say them recently. I went through and tried to find more. Yeah. I think I got to about 10 with him. And so we do this holiday thing where we run 25 episodes kind of back to back. And in order for us to do that, we have to start planning kind of now.
Hmm.
So I had actually looked at him and this woman out of Colorado who's now
Hmm.
being linked to a lot of cases that are being overturned. And I like started putting together links to all of the cases that the two of them are related to. And
Hmm.
I'm considering pitching to Meg, these are the two like sets of wrongful convictions
I
we're
would
doing for the
love if you
holidays.
would. And if you want information from me, things that I have or connections or whatever, you let me know. I'm very happy.
Well, we
'Cause-
may come around and do that
okay.
because
There
um,
are occasionally, I mean, people that really do need to be called out. And
Yes.
the fact that he's teaching, I mean, that just means it's going to, our training,
Yes.
that just means it's going to live on,
Yes.
right?
Yes. And that's what I'm afraid of. His techniques are, and again, I talked to a gentleman who was on Juan's defense team who actually knew John Reed. And this gentleman was like, John Reed is was a really nice guy. And, I do think that the Reed technique has merit. So kind of like, John, what you were saying, like it does have merit. Like, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but let's, do some other things to make sure it doesn't lead us down this false path. Um, but for Lou Tessman, the fact that he has a nickname, and when I talk to people, there's a person in my family that knows Lou Tessman, and it just so happened I was talking to them, and I said, they were like, "Oh, I know Lou Tessman." I said, "Did you know what his nickname was when he worked for Waukegan Police?" And they said, "Yeah, Lying Lou." I, when I tell you that I had 3 or 4 people tell me that, I didn't prompt them. I just said, did he have a nickname or do you know what his nickname was? And they were like, yeah, Lying Lou. I mean, the fact that
oh
a
man.
department, a police department, had a nickname for this man and it was Lying Lou, again, just boggles my mind. And he's still out there training people in his technique.
Yeah, that's I I'm bothered by a lot of things in the world, but like someone so at one point I read in one of his bios or something that he was a commander for the major violent crime task force or something in Lake
Yeah.
County. It's when they get to that level that I really start to worry about them. Like Meg
Mm-hmm.
was saying, like you have to pick a time that they get called out. If
Mm-hmm.
that guy was still like, and I know he trains now privately and like at a government level. If he
Mm-hmm.
were still in charge of homicide investigations, he would be the kind that you need to like I would be engaged in a letter writing and petition campaign.
Well, I looked into okay, John Burge, right? He's out of Chicago, and anyone who's familiar with Chicago and wrongful convictions and like abuse of potential um, offenders.
Right.
So John Burge, I was like, how did he finally? How was he taken down finally? Right? Because people knew about this. People in Chicago knew about John Burge and his interrogation techniques, and I'm putting those in air quotes. And it was like a nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Oh yeah, this is a John Burge, guy. And well, what happened was the Chicago Reader, which isn't a large publication. It's kind of like a liberal, kind of out there publication, but it had an expose about him, and the Trib picked it up. And then after that, it was a snowball effect. And that's what I think about when I think about people who are in a position of power, who are abusing that power to the detriment of other individuals where they are serving a life sentence, in prison, and it is wrongful conviction. That's where we need to have a light that shines on these, not just wrongful convictions, but the people who are actively engaged in them, where we know there's a history of this. We can prove it. There is a history that this is going on. Now, if you recall in Tessman's bio, he says that he has had 80, he said he crows about having 80 confessions in murder cases. He's only had 3 interrogations where he was not able to get a confession in a murder case. And
And That doesn't make any sense.
No, you're correct, Meg. And there was a Trib article where I can't remember if it was a professor out of DePaul University, but it was a professor who said that is not humanly possible. That
Yeah.
80 confessions should raise red flags for all of us.
And I
then-
100% agree with that.
And that 80 number has never changed even since Herman Williams has been exonerated and Bobby Mielek has been exonerated. So I'm like, okay, of the 80, where did these two guys fall in?
Well, a lot of times, the department involved with a wrongful conviction settlement never truly reopens the wrongfully adjudicated case. It's like, unless there's like lock, stock, two smoking barrels, they can look at it and go, it's this person because of this and this. They don't do any more work related to that. They just pretend like the court, was being too liberal and they got it wrong, and that's how it went.
These bleeding hearts, they don't know what they're talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, do you have any pets? I know that's an odd question, but it's the easiest way.
So I do. I have 2 cats. Where my husband and I live, we're not allowed to have dogs in our building, which makes me sad because one of my claims to fame is that I adopted a deaf dog years ago who was my soulmate. And, if my husband ever listens to this podcast, which he probably won't because he is disturbed by true crime, my husband knows that my dog was my soulmate. But we did a lot of work, and I did a lot of training with him so that he knew signs. And we were very close. And sadly, I lost him during the pandemic. And he was 13 years old, but he was the love of my life. He was like the best thing. So I'd love to get another deaf dog. One of the things I said to my husband is if we ever get a house is we'll, rescue a deaf dog, and then we'll foster a deaf dog, and then we'll have cats, and then we'll foster cats. And he's like, no, we won't do that because you'll just be an animal hoarder because you'll always be like, no one will love them or take care of them like I do. So we'll see. We'll see who has the stronger will between the both of us. And he has a pretty strong will. So we'll see who wins on that one.
Well, my wife's limit is currently I'm allowed to have 3 dogs, and that's it. Although there have been moments recently that I'm like, that third dog is kind of like, lonely because these 2 are paired up. So like just one more so he can have a partner.
You need an even number.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
And I have 5 dogs.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you have a lot of space?
I have a yard, and all of my dogs are rescues.
Oh, I love that.
And so I have one dog that I can't touch at all.
Yeah.
She was abused, but she's really happy here. And then I have my youngest dog showed up on my front doorstep.
She was dropped off by someone who thought Meg's dog was running
needed
free.
Another dog. Yeah. Or she was like, I've been watching this family, and this lady, I want to be part of her family because obviously this is where you go.
Well, it seemed like that's how she looked at it, like because she just showed up and she came right in, and then she didn't even really care about the people in the house. She really wanted to be with the dogs.
Yeah.
And then I also have chickens. I have 8 regular sized chickens, and then I had a hen who she had a clutch of it was 11, but 1 died when it was first hatched, and then another one died after a few days. But so I have 9 babies running around.
Oh my goodness. I bet that's adorable.
They're adorable.
Oh, I bet. Yeah. Yeah. My grandparents were from the South, and so I would go and spend my summers with my grandfather, and he always had like rabbits and chickens, and he had a small working farm. He was called a gentleman farmer, so just like odds and ends, garden stuff. But it was always so cute to see like the baby bunnies and the baby chicks and stuff. It was adorable.
Yeah, they are very sweet.
Yeah.
And I guess my last question is, what's the best way that people can support you? I know you have a Facebook group, and I know they can listen to your podcast, and there'll be links for that below in the show notes.
Yeah. Just
I
get the
saw
message out. Yeah.
okay,
I
that's
don't
what I thought.
Yeah, I'm not doing anything where there's money related. And part of the reason is because, you know, for the people who I suspect will be interested in this, it probably will be people out of Waukegan. And I know they're socioeconomically disadvantaged. And I don't want to put a burden. And I know, like, for some, um, I can't even think of what they're called. Like YouTube, you can ask for sponsors or whatever, and they can like give you $2 a month or $1 a month. I don't even want to do that. I don't have any ads. I'm not making a profit off of any of this. All of the research I do is on my own time. When I get copies of stuff, I pay for it myself because this is not a money making project for me. This is honestly me trying to get justice for Holly and for the women out of Waukegan. This is what this is all about. And so to support me, I'm fine financially. I don't need people to help me in that regard. What I want is I want one, people to get the message out, and two, if you have any information, to reach out to me. I give you my word. People have talked to me, but they have not wanted to go on record. I get permission from people if I'm allowed even to share what they share with me. I've had people tell me things that I have not shared with anyone because they have said, please don't say this, and I have not. But I keep it in the background, so if I can confirm it through some other way, then I go that direction. But I keep people's information anonymous. And I do that because if they're still living in Waukegan, they may not want people to know that they are talking to me. And I get that. So I just would love if people got the message out there, if people put pressure on the Waukegan Police Department to be more transparent. We don't know what's going on. Maybe they are actually doing, investigative genealogical or genetic genealogy, right? And we don't know. Why don't we know? Why aren't they sharing this with us? Why don't we know more of what's going on in the connection between Delwyn's murder and Holly's murder? And in the most recent episode I dropped, I talk about Bobby Milak's case, which is another case of wrongful conviction. A 72-year-old woman was brutally attacked and murdered in a very similar way to Holly Staker. And I'm going to talk about in a future episode about marauder pattern theory, to talk about the radius that rapes occur within and murders occur within. And is there a connection there? I don't know. But we might be able, if we find Holly's killer, we might solve other cases as well out of Waukegan. And that really is what I'd love to see.
Yeah, I think that would be an amazing side effect to what the ultimate goal is, to get justice for Holly, and then to also close out other cases. Would be like a really an interesting wrap up to everything, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I think is there a good way to contact you? I think I saw there was an email address. What
Yes.
do you want to say that on the air so we have it?
Yep. Yeah. So what I say always at the end of every episode is that if you have any information about the murder of Holly Staker, Delwyn Foxworth, or now Augustine Milak, you can reach me at justice4hstaker@gmail.com. And I'm going to spell that out because it's kind of long. It's JUSTICE, the number 4, HSTAKER@gmail.com. And then I have a Facebook page, Justice Denied. So it's literally 2 words, Justice Denied, and it was created specifically for sharing information about the events of these unsolved crimes out of Waukegan. And the Facebook page is a picture of Lady Justice. So you see the woman with the scales, that's Lady Justice. And then the wallpaper is of Holly Staker and a photo of one of the kids' beds after Holly was found. And
Okay.
so those are two great ways to reach out to me, because you can IM me through the Facebook page, or you can send me an email at the Gmail account.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I
Okay.
hope that we can have you back and have like some awesome updates where they've closed this out, or possibly for some of these other cases.
Yeah, I'd love that too.
And keep doing the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed your podcast. I really enjoy, listening to basically your integrity, I guess would be a way to put it. I admire that. And John and I are on the exact same page.
Yeah.
So it's always nice to talk with, people that have a lot in common with us and a common goal. So hopefully we will be able to come back, with any updates that we have, and we'll keep spreading your message and trying to get justice for Holly.
I really appreciate that. I do. And I commend you both as well. Obviously, the Jay Pohill case to me is something that I also have become fascinated in because of your podcast. And I know how much work goes into this. So I really appreciate, and I want to acknowledge the time and effort you both put into this, and the fact that you go into the deep dive. It's not the sound bites, which I think is so important, because that is oftentimes what's missing within these true crime, long form, investigative podcasts, is that it is a sound bite more than it is the actual facts and evidence of the case. So thank you for doing that as well.
And it's just you, right?
Yeah. Oh, so I like to say I actually have a posse of women who also help me. And these are women who are many of them out of Waukegan. There are two sisters who reached out to me after I started the podcast, who actually had been working on a book about Holly Staker, and then life got in the way and they weren't able to finish it. So I talk to them on a regular basis. I've talked to other individuals who also have been, kind of like on the peripheral, you could say, of the case, who provide me with information. But like, I have a girlfriend who's a law professor, and she occasionally gives me ideas, or she'll listen to it and to the podcast and say, what about this? What about this? So it's really great to have those people to brainstorm with. And then I also have a girlfriend who is a middle school teacher. She's a librarian, and in her middle school, she actually kind of almost has an online journalism, or journalism for online creators, so podcasters. And she has been the one that's been like, Angie, you're not enunciating. You're dropping words. So make sure you enunciate when you talk. So hopefully you've been able to see, because I'm a novice. This is all self-taught, right? Hopefully you've been able to hear how I have improved. The thing that won't improve is my Midwest nasal accent. That's never going to improve. So people were just going to have to put up with that. But definitely the fact that I feel much better about my breathing, my enunciation, and not dropping my words, that has improved. So that's my girlfriend. So that's how she helps me, where she'll listen to something and be like, you're, doing this, or we don't need to hear you take your breaths. We can hear you go, and then you start to say something else. So you need to work on that. So those are the things that I do. So yes, but I can tell you, they're all women. I mean, I find this fascinating that all the people who are around me and are helping me are women. And so I love my female posse that's been helping me.
That's awesome.
That just makes it that much more an awesome experience when you can look back and go, that's what I accomplished.
Yeah.
Do something creative like that.
Yeah. So, but it was lovely meeting you both.
I look forward to updates on this.
Special consideration was given to True Crime Excess by LabRottiCreations.com. If you have a moment in your favorite app, please go on and give us a review or a 5-star rating. It helps us get noticed in the crowd. This is True Crime XS.
You fall like the stars. I break culture's like a gym, and I lost the motivation to get fit in your expectations.
True Crime Excess is brought to you by John and Meg. It's written, produced, edited, and posted by John and Meg. You can always support True Crime Excess through patreon.com, or if you have a story you'd like them to cover, you can reach them at truecrimeaccess.com. Thank you for joining us.